Hello there and welcome to the 8-man hard mode Zorn Toth boss fight guide. My name's Hayete and today we'll be covering the first fight in the explosive conflict operation. For this encounter you'll want to bring a standard composition of 2 tanks, 4 DPS, and 2 healers. Due to the inherent mechanics for this fight, I highly suggest you bring a balanced group of 2 melee DPS, 2 ranged DPS. However, any composition will be capable of beating this fight, but an even composition will give you the most benefit. Later I'll explain how to handle this fight with any DPS composition. So let's break down the DPS requirements for this fight. The encounter has an enrage time of 5 minutes and 10 seconds. As a point to note, each of the 2 bosses has an individual enrage time of 5 seconds, from the moment the other boss dies. Since this essentially means you want to kill them as close together as possible, I'll leave this out of the calculation. So both Zorn and Toth have an individual health of 3,175,500 HP, for a total combined 6,351,000 HP. Dividing this total by our enrage time, we find a total DPS requirement of 20,487 DPS. Since your tank should be capable of pushing at least 1,500 DPS each, we'll adjust this figure by 3,000 for a new adjusted total DPS requirement of 17,487. Dividing this number by 4 gives us a DPS requirement per DPS player of 4,372 DPS. Multiplying this figure by our enrage time gives a total damage responsibility per DPS player of 1,355,250 damage. This is the number you'll want to push your total damage done to if you're a DPS player. So on to mechanics. There are a lot of moving parts to this fight, so let's jump right in and go over what you need to know. To help organize this information better, I'll be discussing Toth's abilities first. The first Toth ability to make note of is Smash. Smash is an AoE attack that hits everyone within 25 meters of Toth. The second is Backhand Smash. This is a 2-second knockback and knockdown. This should only ever be experienced by the tanks. Next is Cleave. Cleave is exactly what you expect it to be. It's a frontal attack that will hit anyone in front of the boss. The last 2 abilities are the most important Toth mechanics. Ground Shatter is a 50-meter AoE that will additionally lay red circles down on the feet of random raid members for 20 seconds. Shortly after the circles appear, a piece of the ground will spring up, doing massive damage. The second of the 2 and the last ability for Toth is Berserk. When Toth goes Berserk, he gains a buff that deals 200% more damage from all abilities. Okay, so let's go over Zorn now. The first and most important ability is Emboldened. During the fight, Toth will leap to Zorn. When this happens, Zorn will become emboldened, and anyone within 30 meters of Zorn will receive a debuff called Fearful. This debuff lasts 15 seconds and causes the player to take double damage from Zorn abilities and causes any player damage directed at Zorn to be directed back to the player for a huge amount of damage. The next ability is Shriek, which in and of itself does very little damage to anyone within 25 meters. When Shriek goes out, however, Zorn will leave 2 debuffs on any player within range of the attack. The first is Mental Anguish, which is a damage over time debuff that can be cleansed. The second is Weakened, which applies a stacking debuff that causes the player to do less and less damage over time. This can also be cleansed. Since both of these debuffs go out together, one cleanse will remove both at once. Baradium Toss is a 25-meter attack that causes Zorn to randomly select players within 25 meters for a single damaging attack. Along with this ability, one random player will be selected and receive a yellow circle around their feet. The next ability is Zorn's follow-up to Baradium Toss and it's called Baradium Heave. This is a 4-second channel that causes Zorn to throw a Baradium boulder at the player who holds the yellow circle. At the time this ability starts to channel, the yellow circle on the player will drop and turn purple. The last ability from Zorn is Sonic Paralysis. This ability will CC Zorn's current target for 20 seconds. This ability can be removed through use of class CC breaks and certain class utilities. The last mechanic I want to mention is Surge. Surge is a stacking debuff that both Zorn and Toth receive when they are within 15 meters of each other. This buff grants the two bosses increased damage dealt per stack. You'll know if this ability is active either from the buff on the bosses themselves or the lightning that arcs between them as their buff stacks. So now that you know all the mechanics, let's discuss how to put all of this into a working strategy. Let me start first with positioning of the bosses. You'll want to keep the two bosses away from each other to negate the surge mechanic. We suggest holding Toth approximately here and Zorn approximately here. This will further aid in some other mechanics I'll discuss later. Generally speaking, you'll want to place your ranged DPS and healers around this arc, and your melee DPS should be assigned according to which strategy you're using. The specific strategies for melee versus ranged heavy groups I'll go over later. So there are a few percentage points to know which correspond to certain mechanics. As Toth reaches 90, 70, 50, 30, and 10% HP, he'll leap to Zorn, immediately activating Emboldened and applying Fearful to anyone within 25 meters of Zorn. Because of this, your tanks will be forced to swap here. Any DPS that happens to get this debuff should immediately swap to Toth for its duration. Once the debuff is dropped, they can move back to Zorn if required. Periodically, Shriek will go out, applying both Mental Anguish and Weakened. If you're a DPS capable of cleansing yourself, make sure you do if you get these debuffs. Healers should definitely prioritize tanks first and then either themselves or DPS thereafter. Discussing who will cleanse themselves, who the healers will cleanse, and in what order would be a smart thing to do prior to pulling this boss. At 80% and 40%, Toth will go Berserk and Zorn will start Baradium Toss. There is an actual audible cue for these percentages. At 80%, you'll hear the following.
Right back, Zorn! Kill!
And at 40%, you'll hear this.
Have you heard enough yet?
The player that gains the yellow circle should move to Toth and overlap the circle radius onto Toth. I suggest overlapping the circle onto one of Toth's legs and not running directly under the boss when doing this, since sometimes the boss's cleave will calculate the player's position as in front of the boss, and they'll receive a huge amount of damage from the cleave. On rare occasions, the tank holding Toth can receive the circle. If this happens, just wait for the circle to turn purple and move the boss into it. You must get this circle on Toth, since damage from Zorn's Baradium Heave is the only way to remove the Berserk buff from Toth, ending his 200% damage increase. At 60% and 20%, Toth will cast Ground Shatter and Zorn will cast Sonic Paralysis. There is an audible cue for these percentages as well. At 60%, you'll hear the following.
Push them into the dirt!
And at 20%, you'll hear this.
It isn't over! Nothing is over!
Make sure that all raid members watch their feet and clear red circles. Depending on if the tank on Zorn has a CC break or not, this may be something to relay to the healers so they can heal you through this phase. If the tank is CC'd and unable to move, they may get a red circle, and heals will need to heal through this damage. So if you're tanking, let your healers know if you get a red circle on you so they can prep you for heals. At 5%, on either boss, you'll push into burn phase. There is an audible cue for this burn phase as well, and it sounds like this.
You can't win! The Masters won't allow it!
At this point, Toth will start doing double damage ground shatters and Zorn will start Baradium Toss. These mechanics will persist indefinitely until they're dead. So to add to all this talk of percentages, this fight can be very off sometimes with its mechanics. What I mean by this is that the percentage marks can be a bit early or a bit late. The majority of the time this will not happen, but I want you guys to be aware of its likelihood just in case you encounter it. So there are two different ways to tackle this fight depending on your group composition. The first is to play the mechanics and be sure to bring both bosses' health down evenly together. This is my preferred method and one that works well for a balanced DPS composition of 2 ranged DPS and 2 melee DPS. Make sure if you use this method you do not push either boss to 5% until the other is right there at 5%, so that you avoid the infinite mechanic phase for as long as possible. The second method is to push Toth to 10% and force his final jump as soon as possible. After 10%, Toth will no longer jump, meaning you no longer have to deal with the fearful debuff. At that time, all DPS will swap to Zorn and DPS Zorn to just before 5%. You'll then split DPS back up and bring them both down at the same time. If you use this strategy, it's very important that the tank on Toth does not push him to 5%, or the infinite mechanics take over and make this strategy very difficult. This, however, is a great strategy to use for melee heavy groups since you won't have to deal with melee getting fearful. Once both Zorn and Toth are down, Handler Murdoch will jump down from his ledge side overlook. He has 2 attacks to be aware of. The first is Sweeping Gunfire, which is a 4.5 second channeled ability. He'll be shooting this at the person he's aggroed to, so this means your tanks need to keep this away from the group. The second is Death from Above. This is a 3-second channeled AoE attack, which is identifiable from the red AoE circle that appears as the channel is ongoing. Both of these abilities can be and should be interrupted. I've decided to leave out any information on how he factors into the overall fight, since we were unable to push him to any actual enrage, and we tested the bare minimum for beating him with 1 DPS and 1 healer alive. So more or less this means once you beat Zorn and Toth, you've pretty much won the fight. So if you happen to lose people right at the end when Zorn and Toth die, if one enrages and kills half of your group, don't give up, since Murdoch can be beaten with as few as 2 people. So that's really the fight, guys. Understanding the mechanics and sticking to proper execution of those mechanics will get you through this fight with no problem. There are a lot of mechanics to be aware of, and a lot can go wrong if they're messed up, but hopefully this video will be able to help you close the gap, so to speak, and get you ready for what you'll encounter or help clear up any areas you or your group may be struggling with. So if this video helped you, feel free to pay it forward and help us by dropping us a like and subscribing. It definitely helps us out, guys, and keeps us motivated to keep making these guides. So until next time, guys, take care and enjoy the fight.
Zorn Toth! Rip them apart! The Masters will reward us! Strike back, Zorn! Kill! Cast them into the dirt! The Masters will reward us! Have you had enough yet? The Masters will reward us! It isn't over! Nothing is over! The Masters will reward us! You can't win! The Masters won't allow it! Zorn! You'll pay! Masters! Forgive me.